You know, there are few topics out there that are as complex, or honestly as heated, as trying to put a date on India's ancient epics. We're talking the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. But what if the biggest clues have been hiding in plain sight this whole time, written in the stars themselves? Today, we're going to dive in and see what the astronomy in these incredible texts really tells us.
Right now, the whole debate is kind of split into two completely different camps. On one side, you have people using modern software, plugging in data, and claiming they found an exact date, down to the year, like 3102 BCE. And then on the other side, you have folks who say, nope, it's all just poetic fiction. They dismiss all those celestial clues as nothing more than myth.
But here's a thought. What if both of those extremes are, well, wrong? What if the real answer isn't a single date or a total dismissal, but something else entirely? That's the question we're going to dig into, and we're going to use the stars as our guide.
Okay, first things first. We need to understand the tool we're working with here. And spoiler alert, it's not about running complex calculations on a supercomputer. It's about understanding how people in the Iron Age actually used the sky. For them, it was their clock, their calendar, their everything.
See, for them, looking at the stars was all about observation, not complicated math. It was practical. It told you when to plant your crops, when the seasons were turning, and when to hold important rituals. And get this, star patterns were also a way to remember and pass down stories from one generation to the next. It was a living, breathing part of their culture.
So, and this is maybe the most important point of this whole explainer, the astronomical references in the epics are not precise timestamps. Think of them more like temporal brackets. They give us a historical window, a plausible range of time when these stories were taking shape.
All right, so if we're looking for that historical window, where do we start? Well, it turns out there's one celestial clue that stands out above all the others. You could call it the nakshatra key. It's the clue that unlocks this whole puzzle.
So what in the world are nakshatras? Simply put, there are 27 specific constellations or sectors of the night sky that the moon passes through on its journey. This system was the absolute foundation of early Indian astronomy. It was their original star map long before other systems arrived.
And here it is. This is the big aha moment. The epics are absolutely packed with references to these nakshatras. But you know what they don't mention? Not even once? The 12-sign zodiac. Aries, Taurus, Gemini. We know the zodiac system was introduced to India after 400 BCE. So the fact that it's completely absent from the epics is a massive, massive clue. It tells us the core of these texts has to be older than that.
Okay, so now that we have this nakshatra key, let's go back and look at those myths about finding one exact, super precise date, because this is where things start to fall apart for those theories.
Let's take that popular 3102 BCE date. The epics clearly describe an Iron Age society with iron weapons, war chariots, and large organized kingdoms. But here's the problem. Archaeology tells us that kind of society just didn't exist in that part of India before about 1200 BCE. We're talking about a gap of nearly 2,000 years. That's a huge discrepancy.
And this leads us to a really powerful rule for this kind of historical detective work. You can make the sky map say a lot of different things depending on how you interpret it. But you can't ignore the hard evidence from the ground. As the source material puts it so perfectly, if the sky suggests one date and the Earth another, the Earth wins. The physical evidence has to take precedence.
So you might be thinking, but what about all those really dramatic descriptions of eclipses and planets going backwards in the Mahabharata? Well, most scholars think those were likely added to the text later on. They weren't meant to be a literal scientific log of celestial events. They were a powerful literary device to show just how cataclysmic and traumatic the Great War was. It's symbolism, not data.
So, if we can't get a precise timestamp, does that mean all this astronomical stuff is useless? No, not at all. In fact, what the sky does confirm for us is arguably way more valuable for understanding the true history of these texts.
The astronomy acts as a seal of authenticity for the world described in the epics. It confirms that these stories come from a culture with a pre-zodiacal worldview, one that was deeply observational and passed its memories down orally. And most importantly, it rules out the idea that someone just made these stories up much later, because anyone writing in, say, 500 AD, would have almost certainly used the zodiac system. They wouldn't have known how to fake an older worldview so perfectly.
So, when you combine the evidence from the sky, the nakshatras, with the evidence from the Earth, the archaeology, you get your answer. It's not a single year. It's that historical window we were looking for, roughly 1200 to 800 BCE.
This is the period when the core events and cultural memories that make up the epics most likely took shape.
And this brings us to one last, really crucial idea. This whole search for one specific year, it's a totally modern obsession. It's like we're asking the wrong question of these ancient texts. We're committing what's called a category error.
You see, demanding a BC or AD date from the Mahabharata is like asking for GPS coordinates from an old hand-drawn pirate map. It just doesn't compute. We think of time as the straight, linear chronology of numbered years. But for ancient societies, time was more cyclical. It was measured by the changing seasons, the reigns of different kings, major rituals, or big disasters.
So, here's the ultimate takeaway for today. In the Indian epics, the role of astronomy isn't for calculation, it's for authentication. It doesn't give us a timestamp, it gives us something much better, a time capsule. It validates the world from which these stories emerged.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Does a history or a memory or a story need a precise timestamp pinned to it for it to be real and meaningful? What the Indian epics show us is that sometimes getting a clear window into a lost world is far, far more valuable than just a single point on a timeline.